I think part of the reason why we're so sensitive, or at least our ruling class is so sensitive about this, by the way, about a third of Canadians, I think, would welcome this. I think Trudeau himself is to blame, actually. When Justin Trudeau first won election in 2015, he told an American newspaper, not a Canadian newspaper, he told the New York Times, and I quote, "There is no core identity, no mainstream in Canada." He said we're, quote, "the first postnational state." Where did you get off saying that? It wasn't true. But since then, he's gone about making that true, hasn't he? He's taken our founding prime minister off the $10 bill and generally purging Sir John A. Macdonald from all public discussion other than calling him a racist. Trudeau has altered our national anthem. Who let him do that? He's accused Canada, and therefore Canadians, of committing a genocide against our Indigenous people. But, he won't say that same word about China and its treatment of the Uyghurs, even though they have 1 million of them in a concentration camp. Trudeau has removed historical symbols from our passport, just little symbols, just to tell us to forget who we are. Trudeau regularly accuses Canadians of being racist and sexist and transphobic, even though he's the one who dressed up in blackface and he's the one who sexually assaulted Rose Knight in Creston, BC. He just said he experienced it differently than she did. Remember that?
It's not just one side of the story that matters, that the same interactions could be experienced very differently from one person to the next. And I am not going to speak for the woman in question. I would never presume to speak for her. But I know that there is an awful lot of reflection to be had as we move forward as a society on how people perceive different interactions. Like I said, I do not feel that I acted inappropriately in any way, but I respect the fact that someone else might have experienced that differently. And this is part of the reflections that we have to go through.
Trudeau has devalued our citizenship, giving millions of foreigners unvetted access to Canada. Did you see that little social media video circulating in the past couple of days? Take a look at this. The world's laughing at us. It didn't used to be that way. Trudeau actually says we have lots to learn from returning ISIS terrorists. Remember that?
There's a range of experiences when people come home, and we know that actually someone who has engaged and turned away from that hateful ideology can be an extraordinarily powerful voice for preventing radicalization in future generations.
Some immigrants probably really want to know more about Canada and how to be Canadian. Trudeau is opposed to that. He's scrapped the Canadian citizenship test for new Canadians. You don't have to know anything about Canada anymore. Other national symbols, well, he's denuded our military to the point where we can't even participate in NATO war games because we lack modern equipment to fly along next to our allies. But he can afford tampon dispensers in male bathrooms on Canadian Forces bases, you bet. Canada's Veteran Affairs Department now constantly recommends assisted suicide to vets with PTSD. They claim it's a mistake every time, but they keep doing it. I could go on. In short, Justin Trudeau has done everything to demoralize Canada, to denature us, to deracinate us, to cut us off at the roots. That's why Trump's statements about becoming the 51st state sting. That's why they hit home. Because for a decade, Trudeau and every institution in the country, the regime media, they've been awful, the universities, the courts, the parliament, worst of all, school for young people, they've said Canada means nothing. Actually, if it means anything, it means bad things. Colonialism, settlers, climate crimes. Every one of Trudeau's actions says Canada means nothing. Canada's just a hotel. Well, Donald Trump knows a little bit about hotels, doesn't he? Why wouldn't he try to buy one, especially one that's for sale cheap It's dilapidated. You know, we really should rehabilitate Sir John A. Macdonald. Think about it. Think about when he was prime minister. He understood why Canada was not America. We could be friends, we could be best friends, but we were different. It's one of the reasons why he built the Canadian Pacific Railway. He saw America eyeing Western Canada. Remember, they had just bought Alaska from the Russians. And if you think BC's disconnected from Ottawa today, imagine what it was like back then. No railway, no telephones. That's why they called it the Canadian Pacific Railway. It was his way of bolting the country together so America didn't take all the land all the way up. Call it Manifest Destiny. And look at that name, CPR. Canada's different now. I think the CPR is actually owned by Americans. Isn't that symbolic? Now, some of the differences between us and Americans, they're not that big. I mean, we're more passive than them. I think we can admit that. We don't fight for our freedoms as hard as they do. I mean, remember, they were born in a revolution, a military revolution. We sort of had an evolution or a devolution, you could say. We were created by the British North America Act, an act of parliament, weren't we? That's why we still have the king. That's why we, by the way, there's a lot to be said for it. After the U.S. Revolutionary War, people who were loyal to King George, they moved north in big numbers. They were called the United Empire Loyalists. They came to Ontario mainly. That was 250 years ago, but it's still in our blood, I wish we had more American weather up here. I don't think we can ever change that, but many of the other reasons to love America are things that we used to have here but have been taken away from us. We used to be more prosperous. I don't know if you remember this, but under Stephen Harper, we actually reached the point where the average Canadian was earning more than the average American. It's hard to even believe that because now we're as poor as Mississippi. Our Canadian dollar actually, do you remember this? Used to be worth more than a US dollar. So going to the US was cheap and fun. I remember people were buying cars in the US and driving them up because they were so cheap given our dollar. Canada was always smaller than America, but we were proud, weren't we? I mean, Stephen Harper made our voice heard on everything from Israel to Russia to Ukraine to China to India. And there were Canadian values that he projected around the world. Trudeau flipped that around, didn't he? We don't project Canadian values to the world anymore, do we? We have imported foreign values as Trudeau panders to every foreign diaspora here, especially the pro-Hamas extremists he's brought in by the million. That's where we are now. After 10 years of getting poorer and getting more alienated and more demoralized in our own home, can you blame someone, especially someone who can't make ends meet, someone who's being called a racist by Trudeau? Can you blame someone who says, yeah, maybe we should be part of the USA? For one thing, under Donald Trump at least, they're proud again, aren't they? They have hope again. They're patriotic again. Trudeau turned the flag and the anthem into hate symbols in Canada. They really did after the trucker convoy. Trump loves patriotism. I don't think we need to be taken over by the United States, though. I say that as someone who is patriotic, but I say that as a matter of common sense. I mean, you can have your best friend live right next to you as your neighbor, but you wouldn't join your houses together. You'd still have doors and probably a fence between your properties. Could be your best friend, but you don't actually join your houses together. I believe in selling our resources to the U.S. as our best happy customer. Trudeau doesn't. He cut off all sorts of pipelines, didn't he? I like having an ease of travel between us. I like having a military alliance with America. They protect us from the bad guys. I like being next to the freest, safest country in the world as opposed to being in a rougher neighborhood like Israel or Taiwan or even Australia. That's just dumb luck, though. Trump is angry with Canada. More to the point, I think he's angry at Trudeau. He's angry that illegal migrants and illegal drugs come across our border into the States, not as much as on the Mexican border, but we were supposed to be good buddies, weren't we? Again, good neighbors have good fences. Trump is angry that we're pro-Hamas and pro-China and that we've neglected our military. I'm angry about those things too, by the way, and I'm not an American. The great irony is that Trump is demanding that we do things that we ought to do in our own interests, not his interests. Fix our borders, stop the drugs, stop the illegals. Trudeau literally won't. He needs a foreigner to tell him that. As I've said before, Trudeau actually wants a trade war with Trump. Trudeau wants to be the hero defending Canada against the foreign menace. And everyone cool hates Trump, right? Well, not quite so much anymore, actually. I think a lot of Canadians sort of like Trump these days. And everyone hates Trudeau. I saw him at 16% in the polls. Trump is ahead of Trudeau in Canadian polls, believe it or not. But Trudeau wants the tariffs so he can blame Trump and blame the bad economy on Trump instead of the last 9 years of Trudeau's own budgets. By the way, it's not 100% certain that Trudeau is gone. He said he will resign, but he didn't give a specific date now, did he? And maybe he'll change his mind. His father, Pierre Trudeau, resigned in 1979. Then Joe Clark won and was a disaster. And Pierre Trudeau decided to come back again in 1980. And he did his worst work in that last bonus term, including the National Energy Program. You don't think that Justin Trudeau knows that history? Trudeau Jr. isn't necessarily done. And he might even ask the Governor General to end the prorogation and call a snap election. I don't know. It could happen. It's just nuts that we don't have a working government during this crisis. Here's Trudeau storming out of a Liberal caucus meeting earlier today. Just take a look. He left after 30 minutes. It was a 6-hour meeting. Take a look.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau.
Vous partez déjà? Vous partez?
Oui, j'ai du travail à faire en tant que Premier ministre.
Yikes. You left after half an hour. He probably spoke for 25 minutes of that. We know it wasn't pretty. I'd love to hear what actually went on in there.